Hello and welcome to the Car Care channel, and welcome to the 2024 Lexus GX550. One of the most important Lexus models, and one that has been completely redesigned from the ground up for 2024. And in today's video, we're going to do a proper technical review under the hood, under the truck, inside it and outside it, to see if Lexus did good with this complete redesign or not, right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood, which is a radical departure from everything we've known about the GX. I mean, this drivetrain is completely different. In some areas it is better, in some areas depends. Let's get started. So the most important thing to note here is this truck is going to be made in Japan. So the powertrain is actually exactly the same as that of the LX600. With one small tweak. So the LX600 makes over 400 horsepower. This one actually makes 349 horsepower. Torque is the same though, and that's, I feel like, is intentionally detuned this to just kind of give their flagship LX600 the more power, because it's exactly the same powertrain down to every little thing. And that is an interesting thing and kind of a return to the past. If you go back in time to the GX470 and the LX470, that was the last time they shared the exact same engine. But at that time, the LX470 had more power, very little more power, but still, it had a little bit more power because it was the flagship model. Let's start with the engine. This is the V35A FTS, the new V6 twin turbo that is replacing the V8 engines, which does make sense because this engine makes more power than the GX460, and not by a little bit, 50 more horsepower almost, and a lot more torque. And that is a big deal here. So let's start with some of its technical specifications. We've talked a lot about this engine. Basically every single V8 Toyota or Lexus now is being replaced by this engine. This engine is a very high-tech engine, starting with the mechanical construction at the top. Plastic valve covers seem to be decent quality, especially in this, because it's made in Japan and the plastics are noticeably better quality. This has a two-piece cylinder head, so cam cradle at the top where the cams are, and then the cylinder head which has the valves and everything. This has dual VVTi, oil-controlled VVTi, which is pretty simple. Just have two actuators in the front on each side to control the oil flow to the variable valve timing gears. Things are very, very simple. Block is aluminum. Everything else is basically the same as every V35, starting with the Tundra all the way to the LX600 and the Sequoia, but this is a different variant than that of the Tundra because of where it's made. That's the biggest difference, and you do notice the difference in little stuff, which we'll address a little bit toward the end of this section. Something interesting about this engine, and this is something that they did in response to the common issues with the previous V8s or previous V6s even. The front timing cover is a two-piece. The reason the previous V6s and V8s leaked for the front timing cover, there's an area where the cylinder head and the block and the front cover meet, and that is a weak spot. Here, you don't have sealer in that area, so there's two covers, one in the back that kind of overlaps that, and then the gears and the chains and everything goes on, and then the other cover goes on. That works, but now we have a lot more sealer because we have two covers with sealer. It just kind of adds a little bit of complication, but that's the way they went with it. This engine does have 4 chains, which is kind of an interesting setup. So it has one chain between each gear on each side for the intake and exhaust, and then it has one very big chain for everything, for the two cams to the crank, and then it has a little tiny chain that powers the oil pump, which is part of the front timing cover, but it's a very strange orientation how they did that. It works. I wish they would have just drove it straight off the nose of the crank, but they didn't, and that's okay to keep things compact and small. Now, this engine does have Toyota's D4S, so it has 6 direct injectors and 6 port injectors. I do like that the direct injectors do not sit on the valve cover itself, which is nice. Now, this engine is twin turbocharged, so it has 2 turbochargers. They are oil and coolant cooled. They do have an electronic wastegate, so basically a little electronic actuator that opens and closes the wastegate. The best for long-term reliability, and some of their engines, actually the 4-cylinders, they do have vacuum, but this one still electronic wastegate. But it does have a liquid-to-air intercooler which sits right on top. So this engine came out in the first Lexus in the LS 500. It did have a different iteration of this engine, but in this one, this follows kind of the truck iteration. So the intercooler is actually one piece for both banks, because you remember you have two turbos and kind of two sides. We'll talk about the split here, but it's one big intercooler that sits right on top of the engine. It does have its own dedicated cooling circuit and its own radiator. There's two of them actually, and then its own water pump, and it's completely separate than the engine cooling system. Speaking of the engine cooling system, this is old school. You have a mechanical water pump. You don't have any of the fancy valves or nothing, just coolant flows, and life is wonderful. This does have a mechanical fan for the cooling, but it is electronically controlled. And this is something that ever since I saw that, I just wondered. So basically, this is a mechanical fan that you can electronically lock the clutch and unlock it. So why don't we just have an electric fan like the Tacoma did? I don't know. It just adds a lot more complication for achieving absolutely nothing. I think electric fans have gotten there, but that's the way they did it with the previous trucks that got this engine, and now the GX gets that as well. Now, one thing about this engine, which is super cool, this engine is the dynamic force engine, similar to the A25 and the M20, the newer engines from Toyotas. And what that means is the valve seat is laser clad, and the way the head is designed and the flow, it has a much stronger tumble flow, which makes this engine super efficient for its size. And it does make a lot of power for its size. I mean, you go to the GX460 giant V8, makes a lot less power and a lot less torque. And that is the cool thing about this engine, folks. The list goes on and on with this engine because it is extremely high tech. But that high tech comes at a cost. And that cost is, it is extremely complicated. I mean, the V8 was way too big and it had its complications and downfalls, but this is to the next level. Because of the way this platform is designed, this engine sits so far back and access is very difficult. And you have the intercooler that sits on top and all the piping for the turbo and all the cooling stuff for the turbos and the second cooling system and all that. It's very complicated. That's the only downside. Usually Toyotas are simple, they keep things simple. Here, they had no choice but to make things complicated, and they are very complicated. But on the good side, things are well made, especially in this GX550. We've looked at Tundras, Sequoias, they're okay, but this is noticeably better materials. And I noticed there is less and less here plastic stuff and cooling system. There is some of these quick disconnect plastic stuff, but they are onto a metal pipe, which is really nice. And I see a lot of hose and clamp proper here. I see less and less of these little plasticky things, with the exception of one thing. At the very middle of the radiator, which is a very high quality large radiator, there is one plastic kind of outlet that has a hose, and that I feel like is going to be the first thing that breaks when you try to reach in to service this engine, because it's literally in the middle and plastic gets brittle over time no matter how well it's made. And I wish they didn't do that. They would have found a better spot for it, but that's how they did it. Another thing that really proud of is the fact that the two cooling systems share the same bottle. They're not shared, they're separate in the middle, but it's one unit. All that's going to mean is when this bottle has an issue, you have to drain both systems and service both systems because of the integrated bottle. It is, however, really high quality, especially in the GX, but if it was separate, nobody would have really known or cared about that. The one good thing is, even though this is a very complicated engine bay, the 12-volt battery is still under the hood, sits all the way in the corner, does have a little fancy cover because this is a Lexus, but it is under the hood, and that is nice. Let's talk about the transmission in the GX550. So this has a 10-speed transmission, a AJA0F. Pretty interesting transmission. So this transmission has 10 speeds compared to the outgoing 6 speeds, which is kind of a radical departure here. But I feel like they designed this one thinking of the previous one. And here's what they did here. To give you kind of perspective on how improved this is, compared to the previous model. So on startup, you have an 18% lower ratio, which helps you with a faster takeoff. And then on higher speeds, you have a 13% higher ratio to kind of let the engine idle down and run very smoothly. And the way the ratios are orientated compared to the previous model, it's really specific to make this engine always rev low and be very smooth, quiet, and good with fuel economy. Now, this transmission being a 10-speed, it is pretty compact. It does have 3 planetary gear sets, does have 2 multi-plate bands, does have 4 multi-plate clutches. They managed to keep this transmission small, and it is a direct shift transmission, so it shifts pretty quick. And that is the best thing and the worst thing about it, actually, that direct shift part, because compared to the previous one, this has a lot of gears and shifts very quickly, and not abruptly, but quickly, and you always feel shifting up, down, to kind of keep the RPM down. And it does get a bit much. That's the only downside of this. Now let's talk about the 4-wheel drive, because this is something with the GX that remains. We still have only full-time 4-wheel drive, which is not a bad thing. It's a great thing in a truck like this, with some tweaks. So the transfer case got a little bit of a small overhaul. So the chain is a heavier duty chain. It's a larger chain. And then the kind of the drop angle changed. We're going to look at that when we look underneath it. And then the ground clearance increased, which is a big thing, because you see that they're kind of gearing this toward off-roading. And then they changed the oil pump location. It's no longer on the input shaft, it's actually on a shaft of its own on the side to kind of make things more efficient. Now, something new on the GX, especially on the Overland and Overland Plus trims, you can have an option of a rear locking differential. That is something new. You usually had the center locking differential. Now you can have an option on the higher trims with a rear locking differential, which is pretty cool. Now the transfer case still has, like the past, a torsion limited slip differential to allow for that full-time all-wheel drive. And the few little things that they changed here. So the front differential bearing, side bearing, changed. This is something we did have some issues with. So they did make a little tweak. They changed the type of bearing there. And in the rear differential, they thinned the walls to lower the weight of the differential. That makes sense. The less weight you have, the more efficient the car is going to be. But they also changed the main bearing on the rear differential. It used to be a tapered roller bearing. Now it is a ball bearing, which is a much heavier duty bearing, and that is actually a really welcome change here. As someone that have worked on every single GX generation, with the good and the bad about them, and this one included, when they become more available and they start selling more and more of them, there's really good things here. The good things are well made. Nothing changed in that. Usually, you get some Toyota's other trucks and you get into the GX and the LX, they're kind of in a league of their own. And that has to do with their direct route to the Land Cruiser. Things are exactly that way here. I mean, you look at even the plastics, everything feels solid. And that's what you want here. The downside is this powertrain is extremely complicated, folks. There's no other way to say it. The truth has to be said. Things are complicated. Cost of ownership is going to rise. There's no way around it. But that's the way of the future, folks. They have to, in order for us to keep driving these giant boxes that are very heavy and kind of unaerodynamic, they had to do this to comply with emissions. Now, this does not get amazing gas mileage like you would expect from a smaller engine because it's still a giant heavy box, but it's better. I don't think that was the main purpose of going to the V6. I think emissions have to do more with it, but there's good, there's bad, but I think overall this powertrain, with the exception of a little bit of a hyper transmission shifting, I think they did this one pretty well. You immediately feel that it makes more power. It doesn't have that nice nose of the V8, but still, at least it has more power than it. Let's take a look underneath the 2024 Lexus GX550. Unlike the Tundra and the Tacoma, that when you don't get the specific off-road model, you have a little fabric piece here. This actually has a metal cover. This is actually not the over trail, this is just a Premium Plus, and it does have a metal cover, which is really nice to see that still. Let's move on to the front suspension here, which there is a lot of changes. The first thing is we have an aluminum knuckle now, trying to save some weight. But this is where things get a little interesting. See, this control arm is changed, and it has a larger cross section, and this is actually high tensile strength steel, which is a much stronger arm, and then the upper arm also larger and stronger. The reason for that is, at least according to the tech data here, to accommodate for the 22-inch wheel, because you can get a GX now with a 22-inch wheel. As we'll look at it on the outside, I see why we need one. But the front brakes, they do have the two opposed pistons, so let me translate that. They're exactly the same. The rotors are a little bit larger. It's 13.94 inches, so almost 14 inches here of the rotor, and you do have the 4-piston caliper, same deal here. Now the steering changed significantly. This no longer has a hydraulic power steering, this has electric, and you see the motor living on the rack. You can see it kind of through here. This is the motor. This is actually a very interesting motor. It has a belt drive, so it has a little belt inside that drives the actual rack and pinion to make it smoother, make it quieter. That's why they put a belt, not a direct gear drive. This is a huge deal because now you can actually control the steering electronically, and you can do like the lane keep assist and all these other features. That's why they're switching over. The front differential, pretty interesting here. So they did strengthen it, and they did change a few things. To me, it looks pretty similar, not the housing, which is now aluminum. Although they say it's technically the same differential, just improved a few things inside, but it is an aluminum housing. So there is that. We still have the axles, same deal, CV axles in the front. We do not have any change there. Now we look at the oil pan, and this is one of the smaller oil pans, not as small as the previous ones, but still pretty small, pretty accessible. It is steel, does have the 14mm bolt right here that holds it. Now on the suspension, see, you still have AVS as an option in these, but they did change the AVS, and actually to me, to a good change. They no longer have the little actuator that sits at the top, which was a nightmare for service. They actually moved them to the side, and in the case of the fronts, it does come through the shock, kind of like an old GS in the rear. So you'll have a one wire coming out of the top, and that's what connects to it. But on the rears, they'll have it on the side, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But let's look at the frame. So at least to me, this is a completely different frame than the previous GX. Just, for lack of a better word, the whole thing is completely different. I do like one thing. They do have this covers, which this is a common area for rust for these. They do have this cover that kind of has a drain on it, so when water collects here, it'll drain. But additionally, they do have these openings here to drain water further. I like that. They're kind of trying to work with rust and kind of solve the problems of the previous generation. This is a transmission. This is a steel pan on the transmission, which is really good. What I like about this is, you notice the transmission is in between the rails and it's not sticking down. That is really cool. Of course, after all, they're really heavily basing this on off-roading. Now, we look at the exhaust. There's something interesting about the exhaust. So you do have dual exhaust, of course, it's a twin turbo engine, but there's a very curious section. What exactly happened here? Or we have this tiny little section here. Wonder if that has to do with assembly. I mean, you can remove the exhaust. I'm just trying to wrap my mind why there is a connection point here and here, but you look at the other side, it's just a straight piece from here. It goes straight to the muffler. I don't know what happened there, but that's what they decided to do here. Now the transfer case. The transfer case, again, this is very interesting when you read their notes on it. It's exactly the same, but it's not exactly the same. So the transfer case got strengthened with a heavier duty belt, and the oil pump now sits on its own shaft. So they did change the transfer case completely. But then they did something very interesting, and this is where they're really going after the off-road thing. The angle of this transfer case is actually higher, so this doesn't stick down as much. And because of this change, you do have an 18mm larger ground clearance for the transfer case. That is a big deal for off-roading, folks. You don't want your kind of drivetrain hanging or getting caught on things. And I did notice that they add this little shield on the motor. That is new. And what is also new, the plugs for the service. They used to be at some point 24 millimeter nuts. Now they look like a 14 millimeter. It almost looks like a oil drain plug, which we welcome that, because there's some point where they put the one-time use plug on Tundra and Sequoia. We really did not like those. Those are gone with the new generation, but here they use these, which are nice. They have a gasket. Things are simple. Then we look at the exhaust. Two pipes come in to this really big muffler. Again, another change is fuel tank's no longer here. It's actually here, and it does look long, but not as long as some of the other models we've seen, like the updated trucks, but it is pretty substantial. And leading up to the rear end, a lot have changed in this rear end, and let's say the GX version of what changed. The housing is much larger, but the rear end itself, the outside shell is actually thinner for weight reduction, and yeah, it's all nice and improved and better. And of course they redesigned the entire mounting point, and to me it looks exactly the same, but they did redo all that. But let me translate that back to English. They removed the drain plug from here. Now it is here, because honestly, yes, I do see that this is actually different, but we never had problems with the previous one, and I hope we don't have problems with this one. One thing have to be said, which is actually new to the GX, in certain trims you can get a rear locker. That is a new thing on the GX. Of course the center locker is still there, but you can get an actual rear locker on this as an option. I believe it's an Overtrail trims, which makes sense. That's the off-road model. And then we look at the rear. Things are very basic here. Same style. You do have an axle seal here. This is an axle that pulls out. Very, very simple. Exactly the same setup, which I really like. The only thing is the parking brake is gone from being in the rotor head. You have a single piston caliper here with just over 13-inch rotors and electronic parking brake. Again, we are moving into the more modern stuff, and that is a very welcome change. Now, if you have AVS in your truck, you would have the actuator right here. There used to be a wire that comes out the side. Now you will see a big actuator here, which, a little tip on this, if you get in a GX550 and you want to know immediately if it has AVS without looking underneath it or looking at the option, if you have drive modes other than normal, eco, and sport, it does have AVS. If you only have these three, it does not have AVS. That's actually the easiest way to find out. Now, we still have the brake lines that kind of, I mean, this one is pretty muddy, but they're coated till here, then they're not. So if you live in the rusty area, that would be one thing you do want to cover. And of course, we still have a proper spare tire here, which is exactly in the same space, and the chain that's going to rattle every time you brake hard. So this is a common complaint with GX owners. Like you drive in a drive-through and you brake hard a little bit, it'll do this. Don't know what's the point of this. Supposedly this is to lock the spare tire, but I'm sorry, this little chain, anything can cut it if somebody's really out there to steal a spare tire. But we still have the little chain that rattles. But then we look at the sides, and this is what I really like. But this is again a truck of a body on frame. Things are covered here, and I really like that. They do have a little opening there, but still, you have that, you have this, and most importantly, if you really look up there, you will see right here, that is actually a sunroof drain, which is very surprising to see it finally exposed. Usually stuff like this you never see. Let's see if we can locate the other side. See, I do not see this side. It's probably somewhere up there. But I also noticed that if you come all the way to the side, right here, there is a drain right there. I believe it is a sunroof drain. And then if we look on the other side, there is another one somewhere right here. That is really cool that they're exposed. Usually in cars, they're never exposed. And then we have to turn our attention to the sway bar, which looks completely normal. But we have to, at this point, have the conversation of the EKDSS, because it is a huge thing that they're really proud of, and it does work better with one problem, which we're going to get to. So we no longer have KDSS, we have EKDSS. And the biggest changes and the biggest complaint of the previous GX, myself, I own a 23 GX. I'll never go off-roading in it. Some people will really not like that, but I like it. It's a nice car to drive, and a nice big SUV. We love it. But we'll never go off-roading. Why do I have to put up with the KDSS? And that's the thing they changed. They listened to the feedback and they changed. You will only get EKDSS in the Over-Trail and Over-Trail Plus, which makes sense. Regular models will not get it. But they did update it. And the way they updated it is, if you remember the previous KDSS, it had one actuator and the other side. So there was one actuator on this side and one side was fixed. So you only had one side, same thing in the rear. Well, the new one has 2 cylinders, which gives it a lot more control, not only off-road, on the road as well. So you have 2 cylinders in the front and you have 1 cylinder in the back, but now they're independent of each other. They don't operate on the same circuit, they're independent. So it can really let the front drop completely when you're going off-roading, or when you're going on the road, it could actually pull each side as you're turning to really limit the lean. So they improved it both on-road and off-road. And the biggest thing is, because you have 2 cylinders in the front, you're not going to be rocking back and forth because there's absolutely nothing. You either disconnect it completely or it's off. It makes kind of off-road articulation a lot smoother, and they did a little video display. I can't really display it here, but it does work, and that is really nice. But what is not nice is 2 things. First, it's automatic. There is no way for you to manually control it. It will lock or go to the free mode as it sees fit when you're driving. For an off-road truck, it would be nice to have it somewhat of a manual control, or you can control how much it's unlocking or how much it's locking. That would be nice. And the biggest thing, which is beyond me why they did it that way, you still have the same procedure to bleed it. I mean, that was the biggest complaint in the service department, is the servicing of the KDSS system with that very complicated special tool that is very cumbersome and it's very easy to break, and most dealerships actually have it, but they're broken, and it's just a very complicated process. Well, it's still the same in the new one, but at least not almost every single GX has it. You only get it in the Over-Trail and Over-Trail Plus, which makes sense. You buy a truck like that, you're gonna be off-roading because that's the off-road trim. Everybody else gets the normal stuff. You don't have to deal with one system that is very complicated to service if it needs anything. And lastly, a very important thing. If you look at the previous GX, they all have this, almost all of them, the connection points to your trailer, but not all of them has the trailer hitch for reasons beyond me. I mean, this is a truck, you'd want to tow with it, but it was an option to install a trailer hitch. Well, that's not no longer the case. However, you have this cover. And I hope this is just a prototype thing, because this is not well thought out. Here's what you do if you want to expose your trailer hitch. Screwdriver, lean underneath your truck, get these 2 clips out. Then the door comes out and voila, standard on every single GX, finally. Now I see 2 things with this that I already don't like. This sticks out so far from the bumper that any impact in the back, this is the first thing that's going to get hit. And if you look in the back, this is actually part of the frame and it's not bolted on anywhere. So basically, every time somebody rear ends the GX, you may have frame damage if it's a strong hit. Now the truck will not get damaged, but the frame will. That's the first thing, and I suppose that is the same thing with every trailer, but at least if there was some kind of disconnection, that would be nice. That's okay. And then when you go to actually install your receiver and try to get in here to install your pin, there is not a lot of space here. So you might want to think about that or practice it. Don't do that on the day of the trip. make sure you have a pin that actually works here, because I feel like this is too small of a space. But the biggest thing is, why doesn't this panel have some kind of release that is not two clips? I mean, when we get into clips and that, and I understand usually the off-roading or towing community are a little bit more versed on cars, but this is service level stuff. I mean, you're removing clips just to expose the trailer hitch. This could have been done a little better. Maybe a door that swings down and hangs. Just something better than two clips and this thing just falls off. Oh, and if you leave these two clips out, the thing will just fall off. So don't do that. And if you leave it completely out, well, it just looks horrible. Let's take a look at the outside of the GX550. And we're going to take a moment of silence to kind of look at it. So here is the design language here. It is a square body with a horizontal design motif. That's exactly the words that they used in the design of this. And I'm at a loss of words because I actually own a 2023 GX, and looking at this, it's just like, are we talking about the same car here? Because this is a complete departure from what they had before. Let us not go overwhelmed with the whole thing. Let's start with small bits at a time. Everybody really disliked the giant spindle grille from before. Not myself included. I think it looks pretty good, but we have a much more subtle spindle grille. It's still spindle, and it's still a giant grille, but it's not as big and kind of pronounced. You still have the Lexus logo right here with the radar sensor right behind it. If you have a model with 360 camera is right here. And then we have these slats here, which to me remind me of like an old air-cooled car in the back with the engine in the back. You know, at the top of the lid, you'd have that. That looks exactly the same. And then the headlight looks kind of like the LX600 headlight, but it doesn't. It's like a smaller version. Interesting thing here though, you do have a fog light, but then you have a corner light here. I think that is actually pretty cool. I mean, you're buying this over the upcoming Land Cruiser here. This is supposed to be the luxury models, and stuff like this we welcome. But then we look at the hood. I do like that they kind of took over the design from the LX600 with the humps. When you drive it, it just has a distinct look where you have these giant humps, while the previous version kind of had a sloped hood where you couldn't really see the end of the car. Here you could see it because you have the humps here. Then things got extremely interested when we get to here, because for lack of a better word, this is just a giant box. There's no other way to describe it. The angle of this windshield is going to be a concern, because the last car that had this kind of angle of windshield, owners had the glass guy's number on speed dial, because the FJ Cruiser. This has two windshield wipers, which is good, but this angle is a bit too steep for maybe by new car standards. And I don't know how they were able to pull this off for safety standards, but they did. And then you look at the cowl. It has a very interesting cowl here, because usually the cowl is kind of tucked under the hood because you have the glass coming all the way down. Like usually the glass comes right here and the cowl is kind of cut. This one, the glass is almost straight, so you have this big cowl area. Now it gives it a very distinct kind of old Willys Jeep look, this. But it does have its downsides. This glass, I'm hoping that's not the case, but this may be kind of any rock that hits it will chip it, and that is something that is kind of the downside of this design. Then we move over to the door. Lexus, thank you so much for not ruining the GX with one of your E-latches. This has a normal door handle. I love it, and it works great. Of course, you can lock it from the front and back, something that the previous GX did not have. Again, they're improving here. But then we talk about the big elephant in the room, the mirror. Again, taking after the FJ Cruiser, this is a very unluxury looking mirror. If you're into off-roading and, you know, big off-road rigs, this is exactly the mirror you want. But it's just, the GX was a sophisticated truck that was very capable off-road. This mirror just doesn't match that. And actually, this entire car lost some of its sophistication looks-wise, because They went too rugged and too kind of off-roady. And that's fine, maybe appeal to some, but I will tell you one thing, working in a shop that only works on Toyota and Lexus products. 1 out of 20 GX owners off-roads with their car. Usually it's an older one that is not really a newer one. So I hope to see more of these off-roading, but historically that has not been the case. Let's just put it this way. Moving over to the side, we do have one line, comes here, and it kind of disappears, and that's it. They don't have a lot going on the side. They just kind of kept it boxy and focused, and I like that. The fenders are kind of out, and that is nice. And then there is one thing about the wheels. If you look at the wheels, they kind of look tiny in the opening. So the previous model, the biggest wheel you could get from the factory is 19 inches. Here you can get up to 22 inches, and that's why, you know, this wheel looks tiny. It's actually not a tiny wheel, it's a huge wheel. But it does look tiny here. Then we move over to the back. The kind of the belt line comes in and it has this raise into it. I think that looks pretty cool. It does affect your visibility a little bit when you're kind of looking across, but again, we have all the safety features, so I don't think we're going to be doing a lot of looking to the side. And here you can really see how small this wheel is in this wheel well. And then there's one tiny little change. If you ever worked on the previous GX, as in mechanical work, you will really appreciate this. If you look all the way to the shock, they actually made a little cutout in the body so you can easily take this nut out. This was not the case in the previous one, which always made me wonder, why did they do it like that? Well, they fixed it. We really appreciate that. If you ever taken a rear shock out of one of these, or a previous one, you will appreciate that they did that here, because this is a big deal. Of course, we do have a compliance flap. That seems to be the norm with the automotive industry lately. Then I noticed this line. Kind of separates the top from the bottom. It's just a design line, same thing in the front. I think it looks pretty cool. It gives a little bit of character. Then we move to the back. And the single biggest change about the GX, and this is the first time, is the back door opening. Now it opens up. I'm going to open it in a second. But even though it opens up, there's one thing remains, even in the exact same spot. The glass opens. That is really nice that they retain that. But with that, there is a thing or two. See, because the wiper now is here, not tucked underneath there, you have this very complicated mechanism. I think the first car that comes to mind is like a 2008, 2013. The Highlander had this design. And if you open the glass, for whatever reason, you decide to move this, you're going to break things. So don't do that, because this have to clip into the motor. That's how they separate, so you're able to open the glass. So be careful. And another thing that they're common for is, if you live in the rust area, this loves to seize, and now the thing doesn't work because it's a separate mechanism. Bar taillight, I actually like this bar taillight. I think it looks proper, and Lexus written out here. You don't have a Lexus logo. This is kind of following their new design language. What I love about this is it has a bumper, and a pretty big one. Like all new cars, even the LX is losing its bumper where you have just this and immediately cut. No, this has a proper bumper with even a little area. And then there is this. We looked at it a little bit ago. This is trailer hitch. I don't know what happened there. Did they forget again? Because the previous GX did not have the trailer hitch built into it, and it was kind of didn't make sense at all. This one does, but this does not look nice. It just feels like a complete afterthought and something they put on last. And the best part is, even the high luxury plus, ultra luxury plus, will still have the exact same thing. And I hope all the cars we're looking at, this is a prototype, all the ones that have come out are prototypes. I hope this gets painted body color, because this is just flat black, unpainted. So that's that. I love that they don't have all kinds of badging. No, they kept it GX550, although this should be a GX340, but it is a GX550. And then we look at the back with the door opening this way. This is a big thing. Depends which side of the fence you sit on. Some will love it, Some will really miss the side opening door, and that's a matter of taste. I think this has its benefits and downsides, so is the side opening door. But now it's power with a kick sensor. And it does have, you can open it, you can close it, or close it and lock the car. That is really nice. Back space is about the same, at least to me. I mean, might have gained an inch or two, but for the most part, still the same. And we're going to talk about this elephant in the room. Power, third row, same thing. With the third row extended, you don't have a lot of space. That's the same thing with the previous generation. The headrests are still very strange looking. They're huge. They almost block your visibility completely. When you put them up, that's still the same. And then when you fold the third row seat, you do have plenty of space here, which is nice. Now the Overtrail and the Overtrail Plus actually do not have a third row seat. Makes sense as the off-road model, but every other trim does have a third row seat, which is nice. Then we still have the, I don't know why they decided to do this. See, if you look at the previous one, it does have the space for it, for the tonneau cover. But here's the problem with that. Here's where they really didn't think this through. This was a copy-paste from the Prado in the previous one. Here, they still didn't think about this. So you put the tonneau cover, which is, it will scratch your entire interior to put it on. But we're gonna try to be as careful as possible. Aha! Have the tonneau cover, it's very nice. Now let's put the third row seat up. Well, we can't do that. That's okay. We can remove the tonneau cover. Okay, well, let's put the third row seat up. Wonderful. Well, now where are you going to put your tonneau cover? There's actually not a place for it, and it doesn't fit unless you kind of put it, just put it like that. At least with the old door, you can close it quick and hurry. Here, you can't do that. So you have to leave this in your garage. Folks, this was the same with the previous model, and I wish they would have fixed it here. See, it's already wanting to fall. We don't need a tonneau cover here. That's the bottom line. But if you end up getting one, just leave it in your garage, because you will not be able to use the third row seat. And if you do, you have to put this tonneau cover in the second row seat, which is beyond me why they didn't find a better solution for. And then we have something new. We have a very ever so small storage area right here. I mean, I guess it's better than nothing. Old one didn't have this. And then over here, you can pop this panel, and that's where your jack is. Very old school looking jack. It's meant for trucks. That is actually pretty cool to see. I wish this panel was a little bit less, it's kind of like, I feel like this is removing part of the car. Wish it was like a little latch, but overall things are pretty standard and similar here. I really like that the bumper, you have an actual bumper here. Most new cars are losing this. This is actually a very new car and still have a proper bumper. Let's take a look at the interior of the GX550, which is all updated from the ground up. There's a lot to be said about this interior, so let us just dive in, because the tech here is above and beyond. Moving on from the 2023 model, this feels like a spaceship. First, starting with the gauge. It's an all-screen gauge, and usually I am against gauges, but this particular one, I feel like it doesn't carry the same as the other Lexus models. So this one actually has a map that you can display on the screen, which is nice. It's an actual useful feature. You can change some of the gauges, some of the configuration, which I feel like I can live with that. I'm okay with that. At least we put a screen and we actually put something useful in it. Moving on from that to the center stack, we have a proper old school shifter, cable shifter, which I really love. Very similar to that of the LX600. I love this. This is a really nice thing. Now, the infotainment screen is the 21 calendar year infotainment screen. That's its official designation. It is basically the exact same thing as the new NX, the new RX. This is the new infotainment system for Lexus with absolutely no button, just the volume, defrost, and rear defrost, and then the cool knobs for the temperature on each side, which is actually part of the screen. That is pretty cool. But one thing that is completely lost is HVAC controls. You have nothing. Everything is in the screen. Some will like that, some will dislike that. I know GX owners will dislike that because that was part of the simplicity of the GX. Things are a little bit more complicated here. Not over the top, but a little bit. But something very interesting below the infotainment screen is the drive mode select. So you have a button that says drive mode and then ECT second, so second gear start for towing, makes sense. And then you have tow haul, which I think that does exactly the same thing as ECT second, but that's okay. And then there's a rotary dial. This rotary dial, if you have any model that has some of the off-road features, makes sense because you either select drive mode or crawl, or you can kind of configure it as you need. But in the models that don't have that, it is completely redundant. Basically, all it does is you press drive mode and then you change, and that's it. So why do we have a drive mode button? I don't know. It's just, I guess they didn't think that through, but that's okay. That's not the end of the world. But over here we have an entire dedicated door for the 12-volt power outlet. I think that is a little bit over the top, but that's okay. We can live with that as well. Now the GX finally has a wireless charger, which is very nice. Center console is pretty large and is a decent size, which I really like that. Seats are very comfortable, and in the lower trims you will get eight-way adjustable seats. In the higher trims, in the driver's seat, you will get a 10-way adjustable seat. And in the luxury and luxury plus, you will have massage functions on the seats. Not the most sophisticated massage functions, but it's something completely unheard of in the GX, so we welcome changes like that. Now, this particular model, the Premium Plus, does have a regular sunroof with a manual shade. Some of the higher trims will actually get a dimming glass roof with a power shade, and we did have something similar to that in the Venza, but unfortunately the GX550 does not get the cool name of the Stargaze like the Venza did. We just have a dimming roof panel. Another thing that is huge on the new GX is the complete lack of a mechanical parking brake. You actually have an electronic parking brake, which is really cool. It auto engages. That was something I was really which the previous GX had because I own one, but we have it now. So there's brake hold, which is another feature that is really nice. You'll see it in a lot of modern cars. Now the overall feel of this interior, it is a complete departure from the past, but it does have one or two things that are exactly the same. There is not a giant football field in front of you of a dash. It's actually, the dash is small and you're close to the glass. That is kind of a hallmark thing of the GX. And then the dash itself is tall. And you notice it's very tall. And that is something also familiar with the previous GX. It just gives it a very unique feel. There's more little stuff. The grab handles here, there's a grab handle here, one on that side, and even in the drivers. Some models, for some reason, the drivers doesn't get one, or the passenger doesn't get one, and the driver doesn't get this one. This one has all of them, which is really nice. Now, driving this, there is a couple things that you will appreciate, kind of comparing it to other Lexus models, that they didn't just copy-paste things. This is not a copy-paste interior whatsoever. Infotainment screen, yes, but that is the latest infotainment screen, and they're going to be similar. When we looked at the RX and some other updated Lexus models, they had this horrendous control on the steering wheel where you have to look at the heads-up display and deal with that. Well, the GX doesn't have that. Thank you, Lexus, for listening, because that was just completely unnecessary and very confusing. Same thing with the E-latch on the doors. This doesn't have that. The steering wheel controls, for lack of a better word, are very GX-like. Very basic, very clear. They do exactly what you want them to do. Nothing more, nothing less. The only other thing there was just doesn't make sense to me. Doesn't make sense in a GX at all. This has paddle shifters. I don't know why we need them, but they're there for you to look at them and never use them again because they absolutely feel out of place. The safety tech, though, did follow other Lexus models, which I wish they didn't. So this has the latest 3.0 model of the safety tech here, which works great, with the exception of one thing. This has driver monitor and kind of cross traffic alert in the front. So like other new Lexus models, it'll constantly be beeping at you for one reason or another. You put your hand here, it beeps. You slightly get distracted by the infotainment system to change the HVAC settings because there's no longer a button, it beeps at you. There's actually an infrared camera right on top of the steering wheel that watches your face all the time, and it'll alert you immediately if you're not paying attention. Fortunately, you end up turning off all these systems that you paid a lot of money for, and that's the downside of that. And then you're stopped to make a turn, and then the cross traffic will start beeping because it's telling you that there's a car coming. I know there's a car coming because I'm stopped waiting for it to pass, but I guess if you're a distracted driver, these are nice things, but for normal drivers, that's going to be beeping at you all day long, and that's unfortunately all Lexus models, and that's the way of the future. And then the four-wheel drive control. Of course, this is an off-road truck. Extremely simple. Right in front of you, you have a little toggle, 4 high, 4 low, and then the lock button right next to it. Now, with everything said about this interior, there's only one thing that's a little bit interesting about this. See, when you get into the old model, it has a sophisticated feel to it. It's more welcoming. It just feels special. Basically, for lack of a better word, there's no other Lexus model that looks like it. This, however, even though it's unique and everything, I feel like it lost some of the magic of the previous one. That's the only thing. Now, the technology here is very welcome and the change here is great. But if you own a previous GX and you get in this one, you'll know what I mean. It's just really hard to explain it, folks. I'm trying my best here, but it doesn't have the same magic as the previous one. Some of that magic have escaped. Let's leave it at that. Let's talk about the second row seat in the GX550. I'm 5'7". This is my driving position. I have decent knee room. I have decent headroom. I think it's this right here feels about the same as the previous GX, with one exception, at least to me. This feels wider. That's the only feeling. I feel like we sit a little higher here. Something that got changed here. So these seats don't move front and back anymore. But here is something that they did interesting. Even though these seats don't move, in the previous GX, if you put the seats all the way forward, you have the same space in the third row seat. So I suppose the third row seat this whole truck got a little bigger. That's how they were able to get rid of this, but not compromise your third row seat space, which is nice. You do have, in this particular Premium Plus trim, you do have heated seats in the back, and you do have your separate climate control zone, and you still have the vents on the roof. Folks, just to reiterate this, we've talked about this in other reviews. Putting vents on the roof is a very difficult proposition. Putting them on the pillar is easier. The easiest thing is putting them here, but here they put them on the roof, and that is actually the best place for them function-wise, but it's also the hardest and the most expensive. So they're not cutting corners here, and that is nice. Let's talk about the third row seat in the new GX. Seating for 2, that's the same as the previous one. I'm 5'7". This is my sitting position in the second row seat. I do have some knee room, but the angle of my thigh here, this is not very comfortable for adults. That was the same case with the previous one. You still have the kind of the adjustable back of the third row, not by a lot, but by a little bit, which is something. You do have some USB-C now here, and another vent here, which is really nice. I really like this. They are doing this, and you even have a little handle, so you can adjust yourselves as we go in the third row seat of the GX. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the new GX550. And honestly, it kind of comes down to one thing. I like what they did with the GX. It's a lot more capable, has more power, it has a lot more tech that was very missing from the previous model. But here's, in the process of doing that, they lost sight of one thing, I feel like, the sophistication. This is, after all, a Lexus. Yes, overseas, the GX has always been a Prado. When you got in a Prado and then you got in the GX, you felt that Lexus touch. And while they still have the Lexus touch, but I feel like it lost the sophistication, because now this is a very focused off-roader, and that is okay, but most people bought the GX new because it was capable off-road for that 1-2 times a year you use it, but the rest of the year it was very, very sophisticated. It has a sophisticated look. It was subtle. It has some design features on the inside that was not really about off-road. It was just about looking and feeling good. Now, don't get me wrong. This is very comfortable, very quiet, very refined, nice materials and all. But I feel like it doesn't take you more than 2 minutes to realize that off-road is a #1 priority and everything else doesn't matter. It does give you that vibe, and that is a little bit of a concern. So, did Lexus do well with the update of the GX? And more importantly, should you consider buying one? Folks, this one is going to be a tough one, because I have to confession to make. I am a current GX owner. I own a 2023 GX, so this is a little hard for me. And let me walk you through my thought process here. Let's start with the powertrain first. I think this powertrain is very capable. I mean, the engine is more powerful, it feels more powerful, and it is a lot more refined. It does get a little bit better gas mileage, but you will slightly miss the kind of the lazy rumble of that big V8. Now, the transmission, this particular prototype may be just a prototype thing, but it doesn't shift as smooth. It has a lot of gears. It's 10 speeds. Even though the ratios are a lot better, and that is noticeable how the way this thing takes off, but it shifts a lot, and you always feel the shifts. And if you're driving the previous GX with the 6-speed that just is so lazy and it barely shifts and you barely feel it, this you will feel that. Now, on the rest of the truck, the only concern I have is this is a serious off-roader. From the looks, from all the tech and the equipment, and just the way it looks, it has a very mean off-road look to it, and it's just this giant square box. But the problem is, in the process of turning into this big off-roader looks-wise, because there was always a proper off-roader even before, it lost some of its sophistication. I mean, you look at the LX600, it's still a very capable off-roader, but it looks sophisticated. You look at the previous GX, it was a very capable off-roader, but it looked sophisticated. People could buy it and drive it every day, and people who are not familiar with what the GX is will think, oh, it's this very nice, sophisticated Lexus, but it was very capable off-road. This is obviously more capable off-road in every level. I mean, they improved on that so much that things are a lot better here in the off-road department. But I feel like they got slightly carried away with the looks, because there are a few concerns. One of them is the glass angle. I hope this will not be the same thing in the FJ Cruiser, where you'll be replacing glass after glass because of the steep angle of the glass. What I like about this is the prices didn't jump significantly like some other trucks that got updated recently. Yes, they are very expensive, but the GX was always expensive, and it's a luxury big truck that, yeah, they are expensive. However, if you look at how much they rose in price, I mean, this has a lot more features than the previous one. So obviously there has to be a price change. But when you take everything into account, the price change is not actually huge. And that is a good thing. The downside of that is when you sit in that interior, the infotainment system and everything in the center stack just feels like a copy paste from other models. It's never been the case in the past. The GX always had its unique infotainment and unique everything on the inside. Some of that old school things remain. The short dash, the tall dash, and it just has a unique feel. That is still there, but not as much as the previous ones. And that is, I feel like it's a change of direction. They are really heavy into the off-road business now in this, that even the interior reflects it, the outside look and everything. But the problem is every single GX owner is into off-roading? From my experience, that's not the case, myself included. Some will want the off-roading stuff, but usually not the people who buy them new. Usually it's the second and third owner that is really buying them for off-road capability, but not the first owners. This look, though, may be an issue. I hope not, because they did this update well in the off-roading department, but in the process, some of the sophistication is gone. That's the best way to put it. I'm going to leave it at that. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.